This is the last week of my trying to think my way through the puzzle of China. A riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, as Churchill said of Stalin's Russia. This is me on what I think our China policy should be. And after a long and twisting road, my answer turns out to be, our China policy should be the same as our China policy was back in 2015. The problem is that Donald Trump and all his enablers have made it very, very, very difficult indeed for such a policy to have a chance of succeeding. I am Brad DeLong, an economics professor at the University of California at Berkeley, and a sometime Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. This is the weekly DeLongTODAY briefing. Here I hold forth on the Lee Bureau's Vimeo platform on my guesses as to what I think you most need to know about what our economy is doing to us right now. I promised Wes Neff, back when he agreed to provide the infrastructure for this, that I and my briefings would be lively, interesting, curious, thoughtful, and relatively brief. Relatively. I promised I would provide briefings on a mix of forecasting, politics, macroeconomic analysis, history, and political economy. So let's get started. Let me start this winding and discursive briefing by giving you a chance to read and remember 10 things from the first two parts of this three-part series. A. China's growth has created three Chinas: the Spain-level 60 million megacity growth poles, which also possess the world's second leading high-tech economy; the Poland-level 300 million coastal economy, which is the world's largest export manufacturing machine ever, and which is mostly integrated with the rest of the world, much more than it's integrated with China's interior; and the interior, the Peru-level 1 billion interior economy. That economy's performance has been very good by Global South standards, but subpar by Pacific Rim standards. Then there is point B. All in all, coastal China has managed to grow about as fast as one would have expected, given one, when it started its reform process, and the gap vis-a-vis the world's leading edge countries then, and two, that it is located on the Pacific Rim. There is no special secret sauce here associated particularly with mainland China in its growth. There is, however, a Pacific Rim, a coastal East Asia secret sauce. And the marvelous thing about China is that it has managed to cook with this sauce, even though China started out at ground zero, with none of the market experience and market institutions that enabled growth along the rest of the Pacific Rim. Point C. Coastal China has managed to grow at a standard Pacific Rim pace by stepping away from really existing socialism-style planning that had so hobbled it and implementing a market economy. Its lack of experience in institutions and its need to grab for second-best good-enough practices, that has continued to hobble it, especially in the interior. But the fact that the technology gap vis-a-vis the outside when coastal China began its ascent was larger by far than had been the case for the rest of the Pacific Rim that started its growth trajectory earlier, that was a factor that boosted the speed of growth, and in the speed of growth at least largely offset that obstacle. Point D. However, the fact that the billion people in interior Asia have not managed to experience growth at the full standard Pacific Rim pace, that is going to have important consequences. This is 1 billion people. They do not feel especially rich today, and they do not feel that the coastal-centered economic order of China today is working for them in the sense of making them equal participants and giving them equal significance. This is, I think, a large part of what is driving Xi Jinping's call for a development policy of dual circulation. Have the coastal manufacturing and the export machine produce for the sake of the interior of China as well as the world as a whole. This also lies behind the Chinese Communist Party's desire to cement its authority by giving the people in the interior an identity as members of a strong and powerful country, giving them at least a vicarious sense of being winners. by aggressively asserting China's place in the sun, busying giddy minds with foreign quarrels, as Shakespeare has his illegitimate King Henry IV Lancaster advise his son Prince Hal. And this also lies behind Xi Jinping's willingness to, or unwillingness to, encourage regional experimentation and differentiation. For what if large chunks in the interior decide that a Beijing, Hong Kong, Pearl River Bay-centered authoritarianism and an authoritarian ruling party is not really what they need? Point F. China has accomplished its remarkable growth. Remarkable not that it is out in the sense that it has outstripped the rest of the Pacific Rim. It has not, but that it has managed to come close to matching it. China has managed to accomplish this in 7 stages. 1, rural decommunization. 2, the growth of the TVEs. 3, urban retail decontrol. 4, successful dismantling the state-owned enterprises. 5, the great rural interior urban coast migration. 6, housing privatization. And 7, the WTO, undervalued RMB, export manufacturing push. That's Barry Naughton's list, and that is, I think, a very good one. Point G. This was not at all easy. Other Pacific Rim countries that managed the transition, other really existing socialist economies that attempted the transition to a market economy, to step away from the plan, as Barry Naughton calls it, they suffered decades-long depressions. They underwent enormous political turmoil. They ended with systems that are substantially dysfunctional both in their political and their economic aspects. Look at Russia today. Look at Hungary. China managed it. Point H. All of this move to the market, this building second-best institutions, this kind of tracking the growth of the rest of the Pacific Rim, all of this was substantially complete by 2010. China then had a market economy, but with the government having centralized control over finance and being able to issue a wide variety of orders to firms, most of which would be obeyed. And starting in 2010 or so, China began to shift back toward a policy of much more government leadership of the economy. China began trying to focus attention on strategic, long-run growth priorities. Now, the theory of all this is very clear and right. Where there are substantial externalities in the nurturing of communities of engineering practice, say, the competitive market will systematically get prices wrong. And where there are strategic complementarities, only the government can elicit the confidence by A, that B will make the investments that will make A's business model profitable, and also at the same time that A will make the investments that will make B's business cycle model profitable. Starting in 2006, China begins doing mega projects as an attempt to move beyond simple decontrol and export promotion and to do standard Pacific Rim catch-up industrial policy. And then around 2010, China shifts from catch-up to at least a hope that it can leapfrog. Now, why this shift around 2010? First, and I think most important, there was no obvious next pro-market reform to undertake. And yet the government is bureaucratically programmed at a very deep level to set big goals and to pursue them. Add to this the fact that the Great Recession hit in 2008 and the Chinese government made the correct Keynesian diagnosis that continued prosperity required the government spend lots of money on something. And they found that having the government take control of and maintain the economy-wide spending flow works. It worked much, much better than the destructive austerity policies of Europe or of America's Republican Party. Moreover, they found the government exercise command and control over the banks works, rather than let them stampede for the exits, as both American and European regulators did, and so trigger fire sale collapses in asset prices. China came out of the Great Recession with great confidence in the technocratic competence and power of its government, certainly much better than the clowns of the North Atlantic. And last, next to last, point I. Japan and China, when they were middle-income economies, they were playing catch-up. Now China seems to think that it can play leapfrog and get in on the ground floor with the development of a new general-purpose technology cluster, networks and data and AI innovation-driven development strategy. As Barry Naughton interprets this IDDS, it is based on a consensus belief among China's engineering governors that China right now has a once-in-a-century technological opportunity. Get in on the ground floor of a technological revolutionary. Intelligent and ubiquitous technologies and communications, data, and artificial intelligence are so disruptive that it is a positive disadvantage to have successfully implemented earlier stages. In Chinese thought, Global North's success at Industry 3.0 will hobble their ability to implement Industry 4.0 and gives China the opportunity to leapfrog. With the largest mobile internet market, with artificial intelligence to make sense of what sensors produce, with 5G's ability to create very low latency local networks for the sensors to report to, we are talking about the potential for much, much more than just intelligent machines. And last, point J, all of this was further spurred by what was perceived as a Trump administration declaration of technological war against China, a war that the Biden administration is continuing. In the view of the Chinese, the U.S. has weaponized the interdependence of the two economies in an attempt to hobble Chinese growth, and China cannot accept this. Hence, China is now responding. To quote Dan Wang, China's rulers see a relentless pace of U.S. actions targeting Chinese companies that have delivered unmistakable setbacks to their operations. And the result has been to align the interests of China's leading tech companies with the state's interest in self-sufficiency and technological greatness. The U.S. under Trump has thus triggered a Sputnik moment in China, a willingness of the state to spend without counting the cost to acquire technologies of its own, so it will never again be dependent to any meaningful extent on higher-level technology from outside. Now, it looks as though China will deploy at least $2 trillion U.S. in purchasing power in this technological leapfrog attempt. Upstream, China needs to make heavy lifts. China needs to create sources of server chips, desktop chips, and communications chips that the U.S. cannot strangle. That means investing in fabs, which now cost $10 billion each, if nothing goes wrong, to build something that can manufacture chips at or near the technological frontier. Right now, pretty much only TSMC, Samsung, and Intel are having success at forcing the technological pace here, and Intel is having grave problems. And then further upstream, those who do not manufacture but design the chips. Intel, again, the ARM consortia, now Apple, Qualcomm, Samsung. It looked like Huawei was getting into the game before the U.S. kneecapped it with sanctions. And in this task, the Chinese government thinks that it has absolutely nothing to learn from the United States. And it can do this by using the most magnificent and profitable export machine the world has ever seen, the purpose of which is not profit, not to maximize profit by China's slotting itself into the export machine slot in the world's division of labor. Rather, the purpose of the export machine, its purpose is to gain access to technology from value chain partners and gain worker and engineering experience in order to attain technological parity. From that point on, the CCP thinks China's societal superiority plus its sheer size in an increasing returns world, plus the CCP's ability to mobilize resources for investment, plus the focus of global North companies and governments on the short run and short run profits only, plus the fact that Japan is right now aging into senescence rapidly, and that Europe and America are hopelessly decadent and conflicted, that will lead in a generation to Chinese technological, economic, cultural, and political supremacy. And after that, the Chinese Communist Party will fulfill its destiny. It will lead humanity forward into the sunlit uplands of utopia. Full communism with Chinese characteristics. Or rather, authoritarian state surveillance capitalism with some egalitarian aspirations. Now, what form does that utopia take for the eyes of Xi Jinping and his likely successors? They very much hope it will be a more egalitarian society than China today. That China's huge disparities of wealth today are a growing pain of early industrialization and will pass. But even though they think social power in the form of wealth, or hope that social power in the form of wealth, will be less inequitably distributed in the future, they want political power, and in fact command and control power, to be even more unequally distributed than they are now. They want China locked down under very tight control from the Chinese Communist Party, which will itself be under very tight control from the inner circle in Beijing. The CCP will need to control personnel and propaganda to ensure that A, egalitarian norms are respected and encouraged. Perhaps there will still be oligarchs and plutocrats, but they will be kept in their pace and allowed by the party to flourish only as long as their enterprises are useful and focused, and only as long as they recognize that they are servants of the party and not themselves independent power breakers. B, policy will remain technocratic. No ideological botches like the global North's failed handling of COVID-19 or of the Great Recession. C, technological progress will remain rapid, largely because government will be opening the purse to fund the pace. Most of all, I think, in Xi Jinping's eyes, the CCP can be the vanguard of humanity only if it is more than a bunch of corrupt bureaucrats uneasily sitting atop the pyramid of society. Hence the need to use propaganda on their part to create centralized campaigns of inspiration, to focus effort on national economic uplift, to continually recall the CCP to its egalitarian utopian origins, and to keep the members of the CCP conscious that they are a unified force, rather than a collection of people who have climbed to the top of a bureaucratic heap so they can then give hand-ups to their familial and patronage networks. Avoiding the downfall into complacency and decadence will be very difficult, Xi Jinping and his faction recognize. To do so needs tight control of personnel and promotion from the center, and needs commitment by the center not to a comfortable bureaucratic life, not to late Brezhnevism, but rather to the revolutionary utopian transformation of humanity. At some level, Xi Jinping and company think that Mao Zedong's impulses in thinking that the party periodically would need a cultural revolution were not wrong. But most of all, of course, it is most important in Xi Jinping and company's eyes to firmly repress those who seek to remove the CCP from its vanguard role. That way lies decadence and incompetence, like their impression of the United States today. Nobody in China would want to see a Donald Trump in the place where Xi Jinping is now. So far, it is going well, right? The CCP still has immense loyalty. Even though, say, a great many of its finest cadres were treated very cruelly indeed during the Cultural Revolution, the thought that the party was at fault, that there's something wrong with the institutional setup, rather than, say, a momentary line wobble with the ascension of the Gang of Four. That is firmly repressed, even among the victims. So that's what I got from the last two parts, the first two parts of this three-part series. Now on to the point of this third part. How then should the U.S. respond to this world and to this China? And let me give a long answer to that. And let me start by backing up to the late 1940s, when the United States decided that it needed to, A, fight the Soviet Union, but B, not via a hot war, not by sending in the U.S. Army with nuclear USAF cover to liberate Poland from the commies or go further to Moscow, but rather C, to fight a Cold War. Back up and let's remember how the Cold War was actually fought. Back then, George F. Kennan, who from his post, first as ambassador to Moscow, and then as director of State Department policy planning, Kennan really did set the course of U.S. strategy for the next 45 years, in equal measure as a voice of emerging rough consensus, and then as a shaper of that consensus. George F. Kennan called for the U.S. to fight the Cold War on two fronts. The first front was the less important one. It was to create and maintain a military strong enough to deter the Soviet Union from aggressive wars of conquest, like the one it had waged in Eastern Europe in 1944 to 1945, under cover of destroying Nazism, much like the one that Mao Zedong and the CCP had waged in China from 1945 to 48, like the one Kim Il-sung and Mao Zedong tried to wage in Korea in 1950 to 1953. Those had to be stopped. And the more hottish part of the Cold War, it also required the creation of capabilities to fight off Soviet attempts at unconventional warfare, coups, propagandistic mobilizations, guerrilla wars, and so forth. The point was to present the Russians at every point with, quote, unalterable counterforce, wherever they show signs of encroaching upon the interests of a peaceful and stable world. The Russians were, Kennan said, going to keep people from choosing appropriate forms of government for themselves by means of conspiracy, propaganda, and military pressure. America had to summon the will and mobilize the strength to block that, so the peoples of the world could choose for themselves, and they would choose prosperity and freedom. But, and this was the second most important front in the old Cold War. All that would be vain without America's becoming its best self, becoming truly a city on a hill, a shining example of a good, of a great society. What would be ultimately decisive in the Cold War, Kennan thought, was an America prosperous, free, and confident. Stalin could rule by terror for a generation. His successors could probably do so by one or two more. But if the USSR were contained, it would eventually break down, and the struggle would be won without megadeaths from nuclear weapons. Admittedly, containment would be very tough on the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Georgians, and the Russian people themselves, abandoned to the tyranny. But better that than a nuclear hot war, or a failure to fight the Cold War, a failure that would end with a grave defeat from humanity. Somewhat ironically, if you go to the Kremlin post-Stalin, things look much the same from the other side of the hill. From the perspective of Communist Party of the Soviet Union General Secretary Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev in the late 1950s, if nuclear war could be avoided, the USSR would grow stronger, richer, happier over time, as it was the better system. People in other countries would take note that it was obviously the better system, and they would vote. They would vote with their ballots and their weapons for socialism. In Khrushchev's view, he was very happy to contain the United States, provided containment, true non-interference, required blocking and compensating for the interference of capital. Capital provided both carrots for the elite in the form of economic weapons that could turn nationalist ruling class elites anti-socialist by showing them how to become plutocrats, how to manipulate the market to raise the rate of exploitation, etc., etc. And capital also provided sticks against the people in the form of CIA hired thugs and mercenaries plus pro-capitalist propaganda. So practically, on the ground, in the hotter pieces of the Cold War, this meant for both sides, you A, try to lock people into your system until they become properly woke to the fact that your system was the best system, and B, do this with the best of all consequences. When C, on the Soviet side, it became impossible to do this with a good conscience, it collapsed. But in the meantime, during the Cold War, things did hang in the balance. There were people who did fear the Soviet Union might well attain great prosperity through economies of scale and well-studied techniques of linear programming and input-output analysis. Such prosperity, well reinforced by propaganda, might well prove more attractive than the Western combination of freedom and inequality. After the Soviet Union's successful launch of its first satellite, Sputnik especially, Sputnik energized the United States for an enormous federally funded science and technology push out of the fear that it might actually lose the Cold War. But George F. Kennan had a very clear sense of how to fight the Cold War, and it was primarily and principally to do so by making America its best self, while containing a Soviet Union that wanted the fruits of war but did not want war itself, and then wait for things to happen. What do people propose to do about U.S. policy toward China today? Well, there are a large number of proposals. On the military side, I see there are those who want to spend much more on the military, so that the United States military can dominate the South China Sea, plus ring China with bases. On the political side, I see those who want to somehow oppose China's Belt and Road Initiative and outbid China in Africa in some way. Now, I really cannot complain about more money supporting economic development in Africa. I can and do complain about an American peacetime military that is supposed to be able, from a standing start, to immediately dominate the battle space in every single corner of the world. Yes, any change in the current political status of Taiwan needs to be one voted for by the people of Taiwan themselves. Yes, the United States has powerful economic and some security interests in the continued functioning and prosperity of the economies of Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. But one of the many, many major key differences between the old Cold War and today is that in the old Cold War, the Soviet Union saw guerrilla wars of national liberation. People voting, as Khrushchev said, with their weapons for socialism, that those were a very important part of, quote, self-determination, unquote. And the Soviet Union would, with a very good conscience, provide aid to such movements to counteract the thugs, mercenaries, and weapons sales of the global capitalist international to suppress popular armed uprisings. That is not on the table today. The United States did not cover itself with glory in its military and CIA response to national liberation movements. But there is going to be no similar opportunity to not cover ourselves with glory vis-a-vis China in the future. To be blunt, short of whatever is useful, really useful in backing strategic ambiguity in the Strait of Formosa, and in backing the principle that changes in political orders need to be voted for, there is no reason for the rise of China to lead to more money being spent on the U.S. military. On the domestic economic side, there are clearly things to be done with respect to China policy. No, attempting to pull manufacturing assembly jobs back from Shenzhen and Shanghai into the United States is not a good idea. We would not like how little those jobs wound up paying if we did wind up attracting them. In my view, you digress. In my view, a great deal of the discourse around blue-collar manufacturing jobs here in America today is hopelessly confused. International trade does not destroy the number of jobs, does not even destroy the number of blue-collar jobs. International trade swaps jobs. It can swap manufacturing jobs for construction jobs, or for distribution jobs, or for service sector jobs. A U.S. consumer buys a wooden table of a kind that used to be made in the United States but is now made in China, and the furniture factory job in South Carolina disappears as the money that would have been spent on it flows to China and then returns employing people who cook meals in tourist restaurants at the West Gate to Yellowstone National Park in Idaho. It worked that way earlier as well. A union textile factory job in Massachusetts disappeared and reappeared as a non-union textile factory job in South Carolina. What we really care about are three things. Are the jobs that the domestic and international division of labor are giving us, are they good jobs? That's one. Is the government managing the labor market so that workers have enough social power that they can bargain with their employers on equal terms for a fair share of what they produce? And the answer to that is no. The jobs we're creating are not especially good jobs right now. 2, are we properly rewarding jobs and activities that have large external benefits? That teach participants and also watchers how to productively work with and advance modern technologies. Here again, I think the answer is no. 3, are we creating a properly patient society? One that does not spend our money now on things that the rich care about evanescently, or spend lots of energy inducing people to eat the marshmallow immediately? Or do we have an economic framework in which people are kind of incentivized to be thoughtful, to save and invest for their long-term happiness? And here again, I'd say the answer is no. There is thus a great deal to be done on the domestic economic side. But it's independent of the rise of China. These are things that it would have been good to do and to have been doing, no matter what. Indeed, in large part, the rise of China is a good thing, inasmuch as it provides us with a yardstick and teaches us what we ought to have learned long ago, and inasmuch as it provides us with other options to cheaply get the work that's done by jobs that are relatively unattractive to Americans today done overseas, so we can build good jobs here in the United States. And then there are the issues on which the rise of China and its effects on international economics are actually of the essence. We need to avoid getting on the wrong side of weaponized interdependence. And parenthetically, note that weaponization is not typically weaponization in a military sense. The big example in the 1900s was in 1973, the United States came under the reign of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And because of a strange combination of Texas politicians, mostly named Bush, global oil companies, and Middle Eastern princes able to spend money like water in Washington lobbying, under the reign of OPEC and of this strange combination, they managed to extract an enormous amount of wealth from the United States in return for Middle Eastern oil by blocking any U.S. attempts to move beyond petroleum and to break the monopoly power of OPEC. Now, we ought to have moved beyond petroleum in very short order after the problem first showed itself in 1973. First, because oil is a dirty and polluting fuel, and we would like to have clean lungs. If that had not been enough, there is, second, the fact that high oil prices give a lot of global political power to some very unpleasant people. That should have been sufficient. If that had not been sufficient, there was reason 3. The fact that widely variable oil prices, prices that were periodically high, disrupted the world economy. And 4, if that had not been sufficient, the specter of global warming should have been sufficient. There were 4 reasons, any one of which would have been sufficient to move beyond petroleum. But, all attempts to move the U.S. beyond petroleum were blocked, and the country was massively impoverished. Thereby, we have a very strong interest in not getting ourselves into a similar situation, in which we are charged monopoly prices far above marginal cost for key inputs to our economy in the future. Otherwise, really, the domestic economic steps we should take are the domestic economic steps we should take, regardless of China, which can, however, serve as a useful yardstick. And then there are the domestic political issues. Once again, they are overwhelming the same regardless of the state of China. Perhaps China's rise does raise the urgency, right? That, after all, only if we are our best self can we provide a good model for other countries, a better model than China will provide. And unless you think the Chinese system actually is superior over the long run, the fewer the countries tempted to emulate China and the more countries tempted to emulate the United States, the better. But what is good for us to do is good for us to do. And that would still be good for us to do were China a complete non-issue in all respects. Now, we do know what we need to do. We do need to move further away from colonial Kentucky-style American nationalism. The idea that we are a special frontier people, and only those brought up on our soil and with our blood can truly be us, because only they can be truly frontier people. Now, we are not a frontier people. Historically and around the globe, blood and soil nationalisms are pathetic. And, colonial Kentucky-style American nationalism, that's just one of the same. We also need to move away from, call it, colonial Virginia-style American nationalism. Colonial Virginia-style nationalism, that came to the New World to be free from the constraints of government, wishing not to be a servant to lords and potentates. Unfortunately, in practice, wishing not to be a servant did not mean wishing to be a friend. And it did not mean seeking to be an equal. It meant, rather, seeking to be a master. First of slaves, then of sharecroppers, and always of poor whites whose wages could be kept down but could be inveigled into a belief that their non-slavehood was in fact equal freedom, because they were part of the ruling race. The American nationalism we all know, and that we need, that springs from colonial New England, from the Pilgrims and the Puritans, right? That's the belief that we are a people, most of whom left the Old World to come here. A people who left the Old World with its flaws and its tyrannies, and we came here to build in this new world a utopia. And all who come to these shores and seek to join us are welcome in our building under the protection of Providence, our city upon a hill, our light unto the nations. We seek to make a country so that whenever in the future people seek a blessing for their enterprise, they shall say, quote, "Let it be as it was in New England," unquote. That was what my Puritan ancestors who led the settlement in the early 1600s said. It is certainly true that they would be extremely, extremely disturbed if they could see us today, could see the direction in which we have taken their utopian visions and aspirations. But, it is at heart their vision nevertheless. That we are a people, we are not scattered, isolated, separate, self-reliant, autonomous, unconnected with others individuals. We are a people engaged in a utopian project. That idea is a very valuable and important thing. I do think that America has a future as more than just another relatively greedy and non-utopian nation state with its own rather pathetic blood and soil nationalism. And if so, colonial New England-style nationalism, or rather its fruits, has to be at the core of it. And in building that society, we need to make sure it is a middle-class society, not a society of plutocrats and underlings. That would be to move too close to Virginia style. And in building that society, we need to make sure that there is equal opportunity, not one in which some have so much of a head start that others cannot catch. That would be to move too close to colonial Kentucky. And then last, there is the question of if the United States should engage in any way other than as a productive and valuable economic partner, and if we should speak to them more than as a voice for world peace and human rights. How much energy should we spend making China pay through the nose for U.S.-owned intellectual property? In fact, should we go further and should we keep China from using U.S.-owned intellectual property and force its development and growth to slow by forcing it to develop its own? I say no. I do not want Chinese school children to, in a century, be taught that the U.S. tried to keep them poor and barefoot as long as possible. Maybe that ship has sailed with the presidency of Donald Trump. But I want to try to call that ship back. Then there's the question of whether we should be trying to keep China from developing its own intellectual property. Should we, in fact, be waging technological war? Donald Trump's vague and clownish ambitions toward doing so, they have already triggered the Sputnik moment in China. I think it would be very unwise to continue to follow that policy. We should be playing right now in order to set the stage for political decisions that will be made in the world in 50 years. And so we should act now in such a way that people in 50 years, people in Europe, in Africa, and in China, that people would admire us. Trying to kneecap China's economic growth is not a policy that will do that. That said, I am very happy pushing and shoving to make Chinese producers and consumers pay for U.S. intellectual property. That seems a highly reasonable thing to do. It is a thing that nations with lots of intellectual property have always done. And we should do it. That is, we are passing on something valuable, and there should be some compensation for it. Let me back up again. Try to cast your mind back to 2015. What was America's pre-Trump, China policy? It was engage and embrace. It was work hard so that China would have much more to gain by playing cooperatively with the U.S. than competitively. It was establish the Trans-Pacific Partnership to maximize the United States' negotiating leverage on issues like intellectual property. It was seek to impose international norms. That China should not be the centralized state of the Han people dictated to by a central administration from Beijing, but rather something more recognizing its own geographical and cultural and ethnic diversity. That China should be reminded and urged to recognize that it is in its long-run best interest to allow substantial regional autonomy. Uyghur, Tibetan, Hong Kongese, etc., admittedly, in each case, with substantially co-opted local elites as kind of deputies of the center. And that is in China's long-run interest, both because aggressive Beijing-centered Sinification is unlikely to work and is likely to store up great trouble for the future, plus allowing regional autonomy and diversity is the best strategy for eventually, assuming China then still wants to, bringing Taiwan inside in some form. For Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong to be very happy under Beijing's aegis should be its highest priority. And C, pushing the norm of global peace. There never was a damned thing in the high values of the Himalayas. And with the end of the hydrocarbon century, there is not a damned thing in the China Seas. There is not a damned thing worth the bones of a single Shanghainese, Swabi, or Sichuanese grenadier from this. It was point out that China has a short-run growth problem, especially in the interior, a medium-run succession problem, and a long-run political legitimacy, regime legitimacy problem. It was point out that China still has much that it needs to learn from the North Atlantic. It was point out that Zhao Jiang was perhaps wise in at least trying to think about how to create a party in a space in which the people could be represented to those in the corridors of power, and in which the succession to power could be approved by the people in such a way that people's livelihood could be advanced and social harmony maintained. It is point out that no system can be good or stable without substantial space and protection for Peng Dehuais. People who correctly see the government as making a big mistake need to be provided space to organize so that they can make their case, and those in the corridors of power need to listen to them and change course, not purge them. Peng Dehuai was purged. 60 million Chinese wound up dead of famine at the end of the 1950s. That was what U.S. policy toward China was before Trump. And it was, I think, broadly the right policy. Pushing and shoving on intellectual property issues, yes. But otherwise, cooperation, admonition, warning, and example. As Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev said back in the late 1950s, the people will show those whose system works best. Those who are confident and who have the future on their side will be anxious to be cooperative as much as possible. Now, of course, all of this has gone smash. Trump thought trade wars are popular and easy to win. They are not. The United States right now has a greater political legitimacy problem than does Xi Jinping. The Trump-McConnell-McCarthy-Fox-Facebook alliance, it appears to have convinced more than half of Republicans that more, quote, true, unquote, ballots were cast by Trump than for Biden. The trifecta, that is 1 million, and it'll be 1 million before this is over, unnecessarily dead from COVID. The 4-year reign of Trump the Ridiculous, and the catastrophic failure a decade ago to rapidly cure the Great Recession. These have left China thinking that there is nothing the U.S. has to teach and that they have to learn. That we are decadent and unworthy heirs and heiresses of the past, rather than productive members of global society who still have things to teach and are still an example. Add to that the weaponization of the 911 bloody shirt for wars of choice, crumbling infrastructure. Seriously, from China's standpoint, what is there in the United States that there is to admire? And, they may be right. The U.S. did indeed fail to handle the Great Recession. The U.S. did indeed fail to handle COVID. The U.S. elected Trump, and the office holders of the Republican Party continue every day to pledge allegiance to him. Plus, is the leading edge of the U.S. economy now in San Francisco's Soma neighborhood? Is it in fact technologically productive in any fundamental sense? You have to worry. A country that seems to be investing in finance, its best and brightest in finance and healthcare administration, and now in consumer internet. There is a quote from Dan Wang that haunts me these days. Quote, "The marketing trick that California pulled off to situate consumer internet as the highest form of technology, as if Tencent and Facebook are surest signs we live in a technologically accelerating civilization. These tech giants are highly capable companies that print cash, but they're barely engaged in the creation of intellectual property, excelling instead on business model innovation, the exploitation of network effects, and I would add on cognitive behavioral grifting of the flaws of human attention. That's not the way to build a utopia. Nevertheless, I do conclude the China policy that was right back in 2015, it's still the right China policy today. Many ships have sailed, yes, but we must call them back. We are much weaker than we were in 2015 in lots of ways, yes. But we should still exert what strength we have. At least, the circa 2015 policy of embrace and engage, and of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the rest, that is not something that we will be ashamed and embarrassed to pursue in the future, as we are ashamed and embarrassed of the 4 years the United States spent under the reign of Donald Trump. Remember what George F. Kennan said in the late 1940s with respect to the principal front, the important front in the old Cold War. If America is coping successfully with the problems of external life and the responsibilities of a world power, then the aims of Russian communism must appear sterile and quixotic, for the palsied decrepitude of the capitalist world is the keystone of communist philosophy. Thus, the issue of Soviet-American relations is in essence a test of the overall worth of the United States. The United States need only measure up to its own best traditions and prove itself worthy. Surely there was never a fairer test of national quality than this. The thoughtful observer will experience a certain gratitude to a providence, which has made America's security dependent on their pulling themselves together and accepting the responsibilities of moral and political leadership that history plainly intended for them to bear. Unquote. Now, the United States, it has grave disadvantages it did not have 70 years ago, and it has some grave disadvantages it did have 70 years ago. One common grave disadvantage is its racism. The American dilemma, as Gunnar Myrdal put it in the years after World War II. One disadvantage America did not have back then was the institutional sclerosis that we have seen in full flower on display in our failure to keep the coronavirus from killing what will ultimately be 1 million Americans. Another disadvantage America did not have back then, it did not have today's Republican Party. Back then, the Republican Party wanted the country to succeed. Now the Republican Party is happy to have the country go smash, if only it will be bound to the discredit of some Democratic politician somewhere, and it can maybe have a higher chance of winning some extra election. Bluntly, I really don't think our chances are terribly good of making the century of the 2000s. Un-American century. But I also don't think China's chances of making the century of the 2000s a Chinese century, are terribly good either. The fact that China is seeking, a place in the sun in international affairs is, as always, that's something that's fraught with danger. Seeking a place in the sun provokes reactions. Disputes can turn into Cold Wars. Cold Wars can get hot. There is a profound, unweaponized interdependence between the United States and the Pacific Rim outside of China. The United States does have vital interests, primarily economic, but also security interests in the freedom, prosperity, and stability of Japan, of South Korea, of maybe someday Vietnam, and of the island of Taiwan. Nobody before World War I thought how disastrous World War I might be. And, the Germans did not think Britain would enter the war over what they saw as a temporary and technical violation of Belgian neutrality. That after all, the Imperial German Army in 1914, it sought to use Belgium as a highway, not to conquer the country. Joseph Stalin did not think he was running any risks in allowing Kim Il-sung to attack South Korea, after all. Things could get very bad indeed, especially to the extent that Xi Jinping or his successors want to play the nationalism card, the busy giddy minds with foreign quarrels card, in order to keep the imperial people in the interior from being upset at the distribution of regional prosperity within China. In many respects, the wisest thing about war, even Cold War, was given by the computer in the movie War Games. A curious thing, the only way to win is not to play. If the first lesson of our policy with China is that our policy as of 2015 was a good one, perhaps an even more important lesson is that it is not good to fight Cold Wars if there is ever any alternative. And there are plenty of alternatives. There is not even the hint of necessity here. Even leaving aside the dangers of a Cold War that could get hot, China's preeminence, China's dominance is something that has to be left to history in the future. After all, the dictatorship that paramount leader Xi Jinping has constructed faces enormous succession problems. No society has ever managed to finesse succession problems outside of the very imperfect customs of hereditary succession once it has a paramount leader. And these succession problems are likely to be significantly worse in our age of greatly extended life expectancy, and thus of substantial periods of slow cognitive decline by the one who must be obeyed. Plus, a country as large as China faces enormous control and information problems, and a regime that intends to control everything from the center is going to face them and go badly awry, and no massive data collection and artificial intelligence are not going to solve these. China, furthermore, faces the problems of incentivizing economic growth when security and power increasingly come from bowing to the prejudices of and otherwise pleasing the party leaders. So that, at least, is the way that I think it is. This is the DeLongTODAY briefing. Thank you all very, very much for watching.